Good evening and welcome to our Parsha class. Sparks of the Parsha, the tidbits on this week's weekly Parsha. This week, has been the case in the past few weeks, we've had double portions. And today, again, we have Behar and Bechukosai. These two portions conclude the book of Vayikra, of Leviticus. So we'll start with the first portion, Behar. But before we discuss Behar individually, I want to make a comment on the two names. This Parsha is called Behar. The next Parsha is called Bechukosai. The word Behar simply means on the mountain, and refers to Mount Sinai. God speaks to Moses on Mount Sinai, and he commands him about the laws of the sabbatical year, which we'll get into later. So the focus of this Parsha is the Har, the mountain. The next Parsha, the second one that we read, is called Bechukosai, which simply means my statutes. And it starts off by saying, if you will follow my statutes. Well, on the surface, these two names seem to be very compatible. Mount Sinai is where God gave us the statutes. But if you examine the meaning, the specific meaning of these words, you'll see that they represent two opposite concepts. A mountain is something that rises high. The word for statutes, Bechukosai, comes from the word chok, which means engraved, something that you dig deeper into whatever substance it is. Like a valley. A valley is where God engraves something into the stone, into the rocks. So you have a mountain and you have a valley. There is a certain balance over here, and there are several ways of understanding it. One way of understanding it is that a mountain is a symbol of pride, a symbol of power, whereas a valley, a ditch, is a symbol of humility. That combined tells us that when it comes to Judaism, when it comes to Torah, we have to combine the two paradoxical traits. On the one hand, we have to go with strength, with force, fortitude, courage, tenacity, like the Rock of Gibraltar, unyielding, proud to do what God wants us to do, like a mountain. We stand out. The valley, on the other hand, the Bechukosai, that which is engraved deep into the terrain, that represents humility. That the humility is not a contradiction to the mountain. Even the mountain itself, by the way, has that double symbol. Mount Sinai was the lowest of all the mountains, according to the Talmud, because it symbolizes humility. Yet, as the Rebbe notes, it's still a mountain. If God wanted to teach us humility, especially as a prerequisite for receiving the Torah, he should have given it in a deep valley. And the Rebbe's answer is that yes, it is humility, but it's humility that doesn't conflict with the steadfastness and the strength and determination that is symbolized by a mountain. The pride that we have that we are Jews and we were given the Torah and we represent God's will, that is not contradiction to humility. On the contrary, if we think a little bit more deeply into it, what is humility? Humility is essentially where you don't take credit for something that you do because you recognize where you got the energy to do it from. You got it from God. The more that you recognize God's role, that you are representing God, the less of an ego that you have. So the mountain, the low mountain, symbolizes I'm a mountain, but I also recognize that it's not my mountain, it's God's mountain, and therefore you can be humble. Similarly, with the two portions, Behar represents the mountain attitude towards Judaism, and the valley represents the humility that you have to have fused with your pride. Another way of understanding the duality here, a mountain is something you can see from far and wide. If you ever go out west, as I once did, came out of the airport in Seattle, and the first thing that caught my eye was Mount Rainier, a majestic mountain jutting out of the earth. You could see it from miles away. It was a very powerful vision. A mountain is something that's extremely public. A valley, a ditch in the ground, is very humble, as we said before, but it's something that's inner, it's internal, it's private. Judaism has both focuses. There's a public aspect of Judaism and there's a private aspect. I'll give you one example. It ties in with one of the commandments in this week's Parsha concerning helping a poor person, giving tzedakah. There are two ways of giving tzedakah. One is by giving it privately, clandestinely, secretly. No one knows about it. It's called matan b'seiser, giving tzedakah secretly. The Talmud says if you do that, you're able to suppress God's anger and wrath. It covers up the anger for whatever else that someone may have incurred God's anger. It's a very great virtue to give secretly, privately, that no one knows about it. On the other hand, the Rashba, one of the great medieval commentators who lived in the 14th century, he says that it's a mitzvah to publicize the people who do mitzvahs. Because when you publicize it, it will encourage others to do the same. So what do? And the Rebbe says you do both. You give an amount, a significant amount, a substantial amount publicly so others learn from you, so there's more tzedakah given, and then you add on to that additional funds that no one has to know about. So you can do both. Judaism allows for a public role and a private role. Behar and Bechukosai. Now, when we go into the Parsha Behar, the main theme of this Parsha are the laws concerning the sabbatical year. At least the very beginning of the Parsha focuses on that substantially. And it starts off by saying, God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall observe a Sabbath, rest for God. It goes on to say 6 years you shall work on the land, and the 7th year it is Sabbath, you desist from agricultural work. And the emphasis that this was given at Mount Sinai provokes a question that Rashi raises. Isn't all of the Torah given at Mount Sinai? And Rashi uses the expression, Ma inyan Shemitah eitzel Har Sinai. What's the connection of Shemitah, the sabbatical year, to Mount Sinai? Why does the Torah here emphasize Mount Sinai? All of the commandments were given at Mount Sinai. And Rashi answers, it's to teach us, just like we find here, that not only are the laws of the sabbatical year given in a very general, rudimentary form, but all of their details, all of the nuances of the law are mentioned here in this Parsha. So too, all the commandments were not just given in a very general way, but they were given with all of their details, with all of their component parts. That's the question and that's the answer. Let's focus a little on the question, so put aside the answer meanwhile. The question Rashi asks, what is the connection of Shemitah to Mount Sinai? Really, the way the question should have been phrased is the other way around. This is the subject of Shemitah. It should have said, what is the connection of Mount Sinai to the sabbatical year? Why bring in Mount Sinai dealing with a sabbatical year? Instead, the question is, what is the connection of the sabbatical year to Sinai? That's not the question. Every command was given at Mount Sinai. The question is, why the emphasis of Mount Sinai in this particular case? And I think whatever the other more accurate answers are, I think there's a very important message here in the way the question is phrased. And incidentally, whenever in Talmudic literature, when two subjects are juxtaposed that seem not to have anything in common, the expression used will be Ma inyan Shemitah Eitzel Har Sinai. What's the connection of the sabbatic year to Mount Sinai? It's like asking, what does this have to do with the price of fish? Something like, what's the connection? This type of question is a question, an existential question we should always be asking. Whatever it is we do, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is its connection to Mount Sinai? Nothing in our world of behavior, thought, speech, or action could exist if in a way that it doesn't relate to Mount Sinai. Because Mount Sinai is the place that represents the world's most important event that gave the world its purpose, its meaning, and its mission. The Torah at Mount Sinai was not just a group of laws that God gave, but it's the very essence of why we exist. So every time we encounter a situation, a discussion, a topic, a object, a period of time, whatever it is, whichever realm, we always have to ask, how does this relate to Mount Sinai? And translating this in more contemporary terms, since we are living on the cusp of the Messianic age, as the Rebbe told us, we are living in the time of redemption, on the very threshold of the final redemption. We're living in Messianic times, but we're still have half of ourselves in exile. We're still looking around the world and we don't see perfection. Far from it. Although there are so many positive things happening that we don't even take note of anymore. But still, we have to ask about everything that we do. How does this connect to Mashiach? How does this connect to redemption? And that's really the same thing as asking, how does it connect to Mount Sinai? Because what is Mount Sinai? Mount Sinai is God's saying to the world, this world has a purpose. You will be able to realize that purpose if you implement the teachings of the Torah in your daily life to the point where the world will come to its state of perfection, which is the Messianic age. So the Messianic age is Sinai in its full implementation. And therefore, we always have to ask ourselves,